Let me ask you a question. Have you ever agreed to something not because you wanted to, but because saying no felt uncomfortable? Maybe it was a family member, maybe a teacher, maybe someone you trusted deeply. Nobody threatened you, nobody forced you, yet somehow you agreed. Welcome to the world of undue influence. Hi, I am Prasad, and one of the reasons I find contract law fascinating is because it understands human psychology surprisingly well. In the last episode, we discussed coercion. Coercion is easy to spot. Someone threatens you, someone pressures you openly, but today's topic is much more subtle. Sometimes the greatest pressure doesn't come from fear, it comes from trust. And that's exactly what Section 16 calls undue influence. A story before we start. Imagine an elderly man is unwell. He depends entirely on his doctor. One day, the doctor says, You know, you have always treated me like family. Why don't you transfer this property to me? The elderly man agrees. Now ask yourself, was there a threat? Not at all. Was there violence? No. Yet someone feels wrong. Why? Because one person occupied a position of influence over another. What does Section 16 say? Undue influence occurs when one party is in a position to dominate the will of another and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage. Let's simplify that. The law is saying if I trust you so much that your opinion overpowers my independent judgment, then the law will carefully examine our agreement. Common relationships where this may arise. The courts often look carefully at relationships like doctor and a patient, lawyer and a client, spiritual guru and a disciple, parent and child, trustee and beneficiary, financial advisor and an elderly investor. Notice something, these relationships are built on trust, and trust can sometimes be misused. There is a famous case story of Allcard versus Skinner, an 1887 judgment. A young woman became deeply devoted to a religious sisterhood. Under that influence, she gifted a large portion of her property. Years later, she realized what had happened. The court examined whether the gift had been made under undue influence. This case became one of the classic examples of influence arising from a relationship of trust and dependence. Why this matters today? I mean, let's think beyond the law school. Think about real life. How many financial scams happen because I trusted him? How many bad investments happen because she told me it was safe? How many property disputes begin with I signed because I believed them? That's why Section 16 remains so relevant. When answering an exam question on undue influence, remember three things. Relationship, was one person capable of influencing the other? Dominance, could one party dominate the will of the other party? And three, unfair advantage, did they gain an unfair benefit? If all three appears, think of undue influence. A certain a difference between coercion and undue influence. Coercion is pressure through fear, and in undue influence, pressure through trust. One attacks your freedom, the other quietly influences your judgment. That is undue influence. The more I study law, the more I realize that many legal disputes aren't about documents. They are about people, their relationships, their emotions, their vulnerabilities. And Section 16 is a perfect example of that. Let's do a very quick recap. No threat is required in undue influence. Relationship of trust is important. One party dominates the will of another. Unfair advantage is obtained. Contract becomes voidable. The strongest pressure is not always threat. Sometimes it comes from the very people we trust the most. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. Share it with a friend who thinks contract law is only about paperwork. In our next episode, we move to a fascinating topic, fraud. When silence, lies, and half truths become legally dangerous. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep listening. Thank you.